For thousands of years, the Dark Lords Morgoth and Sauron led armies of creatures they twisted and corrupted, as well as those they recruited through coercion, lies, and treachery. Although opposition to their conquest of Middle-earth arose amongst the free peoples of the West, many of those in the East sided with the Dark Lords and served their cause. Several of the races of Middle-earth actually trace their ancestry back to these eastern lands, slowly spreading to populate the continent. The elves originally awoke in Cuiviénen, near the Sea of Helcar. Yet when their location was discovered by Morgoth, some of their kind began to disappear, tortured and twisted to become the first orcs in service to the Dark Lord. The Valar, learning of their peril, journeyed to Middle-earth and fought the war for sake of the elves, defeating the Dark Lord and taking him in chains to Aman. They then invited the elves to travel west, across the Great Sea of Belegaer, to live in the blissful safety of the Undying Lands. And while many agreed to make the journey, becoming known as the Eldar, some others, known as the Avari, were mistrustful of the Valar and stayed behind in the east. Meanwhile, the Eldar, who were divided into three groups, saw the Vanyar and Noldor reach the Undying Lands, while only some of the Teleri completed the journey, with others staying behind to populate the western lands of Middle-earth. Roughly a century after the awakening of the elves, many of the early dwarves also awoke in the east, such as the Iron Fists, Stiffbeards, Blacklocks, and Stonefoots, who possibly settled the Red Mountains. Others, however, awoke further west, with Durin the Deathless settling the Longbeard clan in the fortress of Khazad-dûm within the Misty Mountains, while the Broadbeams and Firebeards built Nogrod and Belegost in the Blue Mountains. Many years later, the race of men joined the elves and dwarves in populating the continent, waking in the far eastern lands of Hildorien, where they were found by Morgoth, who turned them to his cause. However, some early tribes were able to escape his influence and journeyed west. These men, known as the Edain, were divided into the houses of Beor, Marak, and Haleth, eventually journeying into far-off Beleriand. Yet not all humans passed beyond the Blue Mountains, with some settling the Middlelands. These men were remembered as the ancestors of the Northmen, who shared kinship with the houses of Beor and Marak, as well as the Dunlendings, who shared kinship with the house of Haleth. And while humans would eventually spread into the south and all across Middle-earth, some remained behind to populate the east. The kingdoms and peoples of these eastern lands were diverse in appearance and culture, yet from the perspective of those in the west, they came to be known uniformly as the Easterlings. Although comprised mostly of humans, some believe that wicked dwarves and Avari elves may also have served in these vast foreign armies. During the first age of Arda, when the lands of Beleriand were threatened by the Dark Lord Morgoth, who sat in his fortress of Angband, two tribes of men known as Easterlings journeyed west under their leaders Ulfang and Bor, allying with the elven sons of Feanor and settling lands near the March of Maethros. However, when war came to Beleriand and a great alliance of men, elves, and dwarves rose to battle the Dark Lord in the Nirnaeth Arnoediad, only Bor and his people remained faithful, fighting and dying with their allies, while Ulfang the Accursed betrayed them all and joined the armies of the Dark Lord, leading to their eventual victory. As a reward, the Easterlings under Ulfang were given the lands of Hithlum, allowing them to slaughter and enslave the house of Marak, which populated the area. Yet while these men were referred to as Easterlings, they were also known as the Swarthy Men, and were unlikely to be related to the Far Easterners of later ages, who hailed from the lands of Rhûn. And so these Swarthy Men were more likely related to the ancestors of the Middlemen, who lived east of the Blue Mountains. Unfortunately for these early Easterlings, they lost their new lands when the Valar journeyed to Middle-earth and waged war against Morgoth at the end of the First Age. Although the Valar were victorious, the War of Wrath was so devastating that the lands of Beleriand fell into the sea. During the Second Age, when the surviving Edain of the West sailed to settle the island of Númenor, the Middlemen and surviving elves were left to populate the western shores of Middle-earth. Some of these Eldar who chose not to go to the Undying Lands came to be known as the Sindar and Silvan, establishing great cities and kingdoms. Although Morgoth was defeated, his lieutenant Sauron still lived and became the new Dark Lord during the Second and Third Ages, expanding his influence in the east and south, where they came to serve his cause. Sauron also attempted to conquer the west, but faced fierce resistance, often relying on his eastern holdings to support these campaigns. When the Rings of of power were completed, the Dark Lord gave 9 to kings of men who gained great power but were also corrupted in mind and body, eventually turning them into ring wraiths. Among those chosen was an Eastern ruler known as Khamûl the Easterling, a creature so mighty he was second only to the group's leader, the Witch King of Angmar. By the end of the Second Age, Sauron had gathered together an enormous army, including vast numbers of Easterlings from the lands of Rhûn, and fought against elves, men, and dwarves in the War of the Last Alliance. Though casualties were terrible, Sauron was defeated when the human Isildur cut off his finger, removing the One Ring of Power from which he summoned most of his strength. After losing the One Ring, his body was destroyed and his spirit greatly weakened. Yet because Isildur failed to destroy the ring after the battle, Sauron survived, though it was 1,000 years before he regained any significant power. Do your shopping on Amazon? Then why not use the link in the description box below to either enter the Canadian or American Amazon sites, where you support the channel with every purchase at no extra cost to you. So if you do your shopping on Amazon anyway, why not use the link below and help support CivilizationEx? A special thanks to all those who contribute to CivilizationEx, like Barristan, the soft bastard Beesbury, noble and apprentice Maester, Glegnus, son of Borin, Knight of the X, Jordan Stark, and Simon Toyne, Mystery Knight and rabble-rouser. If you would like to help CivilizationEx, click on the Patreon link, and please be sure to like and subscribe, and click on the links to see more.